Hello and welcome to the third edition of, and a Christmas edition of the Education magazine. And as always, we are joined by the wonderful Chris McFarlane. Chris, hello, how are you?
Hi Mike, how are you? It's looking very festive where you are.
Well, good. I think it does look festive. Thank you, Chris. And we also have Charlotte Hadfield, as you, of course, know her. She is an eminent barrister and dear friend of us all here at Sinclairslaw. And Charlotte, good afternoon, or should say good day to you. I hope you're all having a good Christmas so far.
All going well, thanks, Mike. How's yours?
Not too bad. And there's lots to cover in this magazine this week. Or this month, I should say, because we're going to be covering a very emotive topic of children who are suffering from cancer and the difficulties that they are confronting. And you would never believe that they would be confronting such an enormous problem. And of course, that was an issue that was brought to my attention by the fabulous Dame Catherine August, who is a leader in her field, a board member of Ofsted, and was a former inspector for Ofsted, and of course made a dame for her services to education back in 2014. And she will take us through how she became aware and how she brought this issue to my attention, and that's going to be great, and we're going to introduce you to her shortly. We're also going to be hearing from a mother who has herself been through a terrible crisis concerning her own son, and she was trying to get support for him for a period when he was undergoing chemotherapy, and her story is absolutely, I must say, I'm sure you will agree, shocking. And we'll be talking to Becky about that. We will also be talking about the latest information concerning the letter that I sent to Matt Hancock on behalf of those with autism and the problems that they are confronting getting support services for children who have mental health difficulties arising as a result of intellectual disability or autism. And of course, we'll be talking also about the extraordinary case of Kay and Hillingdon, which resolved and settled and put to bed, really, the issue about the parental rights when it comes to mediation in special needs cases. And last but not least, I must say, we're going to have a bit of light relief because I'm going to introduce you to a global megastar and who, in fact, came to our offices and themselves sought some advice, and that's going to be the last part of today's show. So welcome, and first and foremost, I would like to introduce you to the spectacular Catherine August, who has been very passionate about this subject. Catherine, I do hope you're well, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation and giving me an opportunity to talk about this hugely important issue. I'm very grateful.
Well, Cathy, the thing we're going to be talking about is the matter concerning the plight of children with cancer and what they go through. And please tell us why you became involved in this campaign that we're now undergoing.
Okay, well, for the last 30 odd years, I've had leadership posts in education. I've run schools, I've run local authorities, I've been an advisor with the DFE, I've been acting chief exec of a very large multi-academy trust. But in all the time that I ran schools, I never had a child in my school who'd been diagnosed with cancer. I'd had children who'd had other dreadful diseases and chronic conditions, but never cancer. And in my ignorance, and I have to say I'm really ashamed of myself, in my ignorance, I assumed that if a child or a young person was diagnosed with cancer, that they would get immediate support. And that's just not the case. And I discovered this because I myself was undergoing treatments for cancer, and I overheard a mum talking at the wonderful Maggie Centre in Manchester, next to the fantastic Christie Hospital, and overheard what her son was now going through after having had 12 months out of school, having been predicted to get level 9s in all his exams, and having then to go and argue his way into a sixth form college to do new exams, new courses, A-levels, which was going to be a big step up for him, but at the same time having to go into a class of resits children who were resitting English and maths because he didn't have his English and maths. And the amount of additional pressure this was putting on this young man after having had 12 months of very, very aggressive treatment for his condition. I said to the mum, look, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but surely he's got an educational health and care plan. She did not know what I was talking about. So then I started investigating and realised that it's not automatic. They have to still prove need, and people don't recognise that the need of the educational need comes immediately with treatment for the condition. So I started researching and working with people across Manchester, and I just find it absolutely iniquitous that the only thing the equalities legislation seems to protect for these children is the right to have a place in a publicly funded school. That's just not good enough. We've got all these wonderful medics trying to protect life, but nobody in education is protecting life chances.
Kathy, yes. And so we've started, haven't we, both of us, a campaign to try and raise the issue that I think could address some changes, really, to make some changes to the Code of Practice and the law of education to try and help children in this predicament. Have you got things to say about that?
Well, I've tried. I tried on my own with people locally. I did a submission to the Select Committee. I was asked to by Robert Halford, and they were doing an investigation into special needs legislation because the system overall is broken. And he was really sympathetic, really supportive, and said, this looks like an anomaly which needs fixing. But I sent in the submission with all the testimonies from young people, the case studies, the specialists, professors in paediatric oncology, etc. And unfortunately, it just never got a mention in the subsequent report that the government is now acting on to change the system that we've got. So I think it's because it's almost a niche here. It's 4,000 children on average that are diagnosed every year. And they haven't got a lobbying group in terms of education. There's some wonderful charities like the Teenage Cancer Trust and Click Sargent, but they do research, but they're not focused on education. And there's just been horrendous experiences for young people in schools. It's very hit and miss. Some schools are supportive, but if you're not in a school that's supportive, you miss out on 12, 2 years, 3 years worth of education. It's just not good enough.
Well, obviously, that is so absolutely correct. I support you in everything you've said there. And perhaps it's all really epitomised by the story of Becky. And Becky, we're going to introduce Becky now. I interviewed her a few weeks ago, and she will tell us the story. So watch this clip. Becky, I'm absolutely delighted that you've taken the time to join us this afternoon to talk about the experience that you've had in regard to Callum, of course, your son, who has been through a difficult time from a very early age. Please tell us your story. What happened? How did it all come about?
So Callum, at the age of 4, started having quite a few infections, and then he developed a rash. So we went to the hospital, and he was diagnosed within 3 hours of having leukemia.
Oh Lord!
So we was taken straight to hospital, where he had to go into theatre to see what type of leukemia it was, and then start treatment 2 days after.
Was he actually in nursery school at that time?
Yes, he was at nursery. So he started nursery in the September, and he was diagnosed with leukemia in the March.
And tell me, how long did that last for? Did he have chemotherapy, and did it last long?
So for chemotherapy, he lasted 3.5 years.
Oh my word.
And he was always in and out of hospital with infections, and obviously having his chemotherapy. And it really took its toll on Callum. He found it really hard to...
So was he not able, during that period, what type of education was he receiving during that time?
Practically nothing. He was trying to get into school when he was able to get into school. But nursery didn't want him back, so they were too scared to have him back because he had a Hickman lining, and they were frightened in case it came out. They were advised by the nurses that Callum wouldn't die or nothing, it weren't life-threatening. He would just have to go to hospital and have a new one replaced.
And so during that time when he was effectively out of school then,
yeah,
did you receive any home education or support?
No, not for a long time, and that we had to fight for that. So that didn't start till year 1.
Right.
And
sorry, carry on.
no, sorry. And the psychologist who he was with at the time, who was working with Callum, because he was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress.
Really?
She got in touch with them, and the comment was that Callum wasn't ill enough to have education.
He wasn't ill enough?
He wasn't ill enough.
Oh, that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
That's totally extraordinary.
So the psychologist...
Who told you that? Was that the school or was that the local authority?
That was the local authority.
The actual local authority, and this is Birmingham?
Yeah, the actual local authority who was in charge of home education at the time. So the psychologist had to have a really in-depth conversation with him, between him and her. And he said, oh, just write it down and I'll give it. He wasn't too impressed that he had to give it. But he did give it in the end. It was a battle, but we got it.
And during that time, he was out of school. He wasn't obviously socialising with his friends, and he was undergoing this chemotherapy for, say, 3.5 years, I think you said.
Yeah.
In that period of time, did anyone at the school or the local authority, did they actually write to you and say, look, or ring you and say, we should conduct some form of assessment to try and work out, how we can make up the ground that he's losing?
Nothing at all. The only thing they recommended, which they wrote to, was the welfare officer to come out because his attendance was low.
So they were actually threatening you?
Yes.
With non-attendance for your child who was battling cancer.
Yes.
And undergoing chemotherapy. Well, that, Becky, is just breathtaking.
So I phoned up welfare as well, and she commented they hadn't actually wrote anything down, just a piece of paper to get in touch with me.
So at the time, Becky, did you know, or did anyone advise you? Did you get any form of assistance from anyone, any source, charity or otherwise, about what you could have done? I mean, for example, a statutory assessment for... No,
nothing at all. And to be honest, back then, I hadn't even heard of education healthcare plans or nothing. And my head was all a mess because I was obviously supporting Callum through his treatment. And plus also Callum was undergoing an assessment for autism at the time as well.
So there was not only the obvious needs that arise consequent to his illness, there was also the needs in relation to his autism and
as well, yes. Yeah.
Good heavens. So in all of that period of time, nobody undertook any kind of assessment or advice to take any assessment?
Nothing at all. No.
Really, the campaign that's being pursued now to try and encourage more proactive action to help young people going through chemotherapy and who have been diagnosed with cancer, that's something that you would support, presumably.
100%, because children miss so much education through treatment because it is very intense and grueling. That they can't physically sometimes go to school because they're too tired, they're too ill, they're too sick, they can't even get off the settee sometimes.
And you were told that he was not sick enough.
He was not ill enough to get home support. Yes.
I find that just...
Yes. And me.
Totally.
And I've still got all the letters and everything that happened, and because sometimes it's just hard to believe what really did happen back then, because I didn't know back then what I do now. Yes. But when we did get the education, we weren't provided with the right tutors.
So that was presumably after, was it? Was that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Callum found it very hard to engage anyway because there wasn't special needs teachers. There was senior school teacher.
Right.
And he was only 4. So it was hard for him.
And hard for you too, because...
Yes, very hard. Yes.
So what do you think, looking back at what you went through, what kind of support do you think as a parent you would have wanted from your local authority? And then, of course, equally, what kind of support do you think you would have wanted for Callum from the local authority?
I think we could have had an educational psychologist come in to help support Callum with his starting to struggle going into school and give a bit of advice to school and myself. and go down the route of education healthcare plan to see what support was out there and get a support worker to support, because I'd got a newborn baby as well.
Goodness, yeah.
So the LA could support us as a family to get Callum some education, and how, because before he had leukemia, he loved nursery.
Yeah.
Never missed a day, loved it. I used to skip to school every day, and to see a child who loved school to school refusing because of no support there was bad.
And was the PTSD, what was the event that triggered that? Was that the illness that triggered that?
So that was it was two parts. One was down to hospital because he wasn't actually diagnosed with autism, but obviously we knew. And he couldn't cope with the smells, he couldn't cope with people touching him, he couldn't cope with the chemotherapy or the place. And then also school, he used to really high anxiety, and they'd say they would phone me if he got it, and chose not to, and put the hand in his face to tell him stop crying.
Oh, bless him.
And quite a lot went on. That took him about 3 to 4 years to tell me.
Oh dear, that is just totally shocking. I mean, Becky, is there any good news that you can tell us? I mean, Callum obviously was successfully.
He's in remission.
In remission, and he's at school now, presumably.
No, he's not in school now. Callum is still medically unfit for school because he's got post-traumatic stress. He's got generalised anxiety around school.
And did he, Becky, did he actually eventually get an assessment and an education healthcare plan?
Yes, that was back in 2018. He got an assessment and got accepted for one. But by this time, and then not long after we got the education healthcare plan, the education we were getting, even though it wasn't working, they pulled out because they said they couldn't meet his needs.
Right.
So they put it onto the LA, and the LA.
So from the age of 4 until the age of 12, he didn't have any formal assessment of his special educational needs. No. Even though he went through 3.5 years of battling cancer, having had chemotherapy.
Yes.
And what's being put to me by not only your good self, but also by others who've communicated with me, including, of course, Dame Cathy August, is that this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is something that is rife. This is what's happening across the country today.
Yeah.
Becky,
definitely.
I'm just shocked, and I'm so grateful for you to have participated in this interview with us today. And we're going to be carrying on discussing your story and, of course, the issues that your story raises. I'd like to thank you for joining us. If there's anything else you want to add, I mean, please do. But thank you so much for participating today.
No, thank you for having me and letting me tell Callum's story.
Well, send him my best wishes, and everyone wishes him well. Thank you, Becky.
Thank you.
Well, Charlotte, I mean, what do you say to that?
Well, as a parent, it's just really hard to find any words that are adequate. It's just, I don't know what to say. It's your worst fear as a parent brought to life. And I have so much sympathy, so far as I can, not having gone through it, so much sympathy for a mother in that position or a parent in that position. I guess it's easier in a sense for me to turn to the legal framework because that's nice and clinical, and we all feel maybe a bit safer there than we do really sort of confronting what that must be like from an emotional and parenting point of view. So I think it might be helpful just to think about how cancer works legally as a disability. So just for people who haven't had to spend the last 10 years looking at the Equality Act and the Children and Families Act, here's very briefly how it works. Cancer is deemed a disability under the Equality Act. Some people might know that there are normally hoops that you have to jump through to prove that your condition is a disability, which are that it has lasted or is likely to last more than 12 months and is lifelong, and that it has a substantial adverse impact on your ability to carry out various day-to-day activities. Cancer is not like that. You don't have to jump through any of those hoops. If you have a diagnosis of cancer, you are disabled under the Equality Act. There's a specific provision to that effect. So it's useful. So at the point where you have your cancer diagnosis, you are fully protected by the Equality Act in a number of different sectors, including education. So turning to the position in relation to EHC plans, which are the way that children with special educational needs and disabilities who need additional provision in the education sphere to access the curriculum. It's probably also useful to look at that because, of course, that's what the campaign's all about, isn't it, Mike? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
So just by way of a quick refresher, you have special educational needs if you are a child or a young person with either a learning disability or a disability under the Equality Act, and cancer is a disability under the Equality Act. So we tend to think about special educational needs in the context of conditions that perhaps affect our cognitive functioning. But actually having a disability that affects your ability to access the curriculum is also one of the gateways into getting an EHC plan. So if you have cancer, you have a disability within the meaning of the Children and Families Act. And if you have a disability that means you require more educational provision than is normally provided in mainstream schools in the country that you're in, or if you require different provision from that is generally made for children in mainstream schools in the country that you're in, then you are potentially eligible for an EHC plan. And I just want to talk really quickly about the fact that EHC plan, when you're deciding whether or not to make an EHC plan as a local authority or as a tribunal, if you've got to the point of having to appeal, there is a prospective element to that. So you're not just looking at what the child needs at the point where you're making the decision, you are also looking ahead. I would say you really need to look ahead over the next year and saying to yourself, are these child's needs fluctuating? Is this child likely to require special educational provision? And I think I'll stop there for the moment because legalese is the last place that we want to go with this very emotive and human topic. But I just wanted to talk about that framework before you and Catherine talk about the petition that you started.
No, thank you, Charlotte. Chris, do you not think that children with cancer, I mean, part of the petition that myself and Kathy have launched is to try and leapfrog, if you like, some of this long-winded process that to have to go through to try and convince the council to undertake a statutory assessment?
Yes, well, I certainly think that, as Charlotte really helpfully pointed out, the provisions are there. We're not asking for any more than the law provides. And I think that, Charlotte rightly pointed out, I'm a parent myself, thankfully never had to go through the situation that Becky did, and what a brave woman she was, and how wonderful her son is to have been so courageous during that time. But it only adds insult to injury, doesn't it? Where, you're faced with these very horrible experiences. You have a child who, as she said, skipped to school. He loved school. He's then prevented to go to school because of his condition. And of course, by the time he comes back to school, there's, for him, PTSD. So obviously a very severe form of reaction to school, and it may also be school anxiety as well for others that takes over because they've been out of school for so long. It now becomes like the first day of school all over again after what has been a very traumatic experience. So I think local authorities really do need to be alive to the fact that these children are disabled, even though outside of their cancer, they may not have a disability or a learning difficulty that would usually require an education and healthcare plan. And of course, that it will be so different for them, their experience, not just through chemotherapy, but returning to school as well. And I think that's where Charlotte, usefully highlighted that it's not just about having more provision. Sometimes it's about having different provision. That could be provision at home. That could be provision that's online. That could be provision that's partly at home and partly in school, that kind of flexibly deals with any treatment they might require or gradually reintegrating them back into school. And that's what we really want to do with this petition, but also by raising awareness, is to really make local authorities and parents and children and young people going through treatment at the moment that there are legal mechanisms that they can use to get that support, and that really should be used to give them support.
Thank you, Chris. Kathy, what would you say to a parent who might be watching this saying, well, actually, when you consider in the context the need for education against the real problem about health, I mean, the needs and the rights to education pale into insignificance when it comes to something as severe as cancer?
Well, I think obviously when parents are in the middle of this, and these might be very bright, very healthy children who suddenly, wham, are hit with this diagnosis after only being ill for a relatively short amount of time, symptoms that develop over time. So at that point, I can't imagine many parents are going to start thinking, right, well, I'll just have to go and look at what the SEN Code of Practice says. What they're assuming is that the medics will get them as much help as possible to protect and promote their child's good health. And they should be able to rely on the education specialist to say, well, don't you worry about that. What we can do is this. That's not happening. And what we know is that no matter how bright a child has been beforehand, no matter how brilliant they've been at school, 80% of childhood and young people's cancer will require treatment like chemotherapy and radiotherapy. The most common childhood cancer is that of the brain. And the treatment of steroids and chemotherapy has an irreversible effect on cognitive development. The impact of those treatments starts after the first 12 hours. Now, it means that some children go from never having had an educational need in their life to requiring support because of cognitive impairment within 12 hours. That's just on the educational need, that's just on the learning need, never mind all the emotional and impact in terms of their mental health, etc. So that's why when we first started talking, Michael, I said, you know, there should be a quick way through the bureaucracy for these parents and these children. We know as well, I mean, I've got a sheaf of stuff here, writings of young people who were saying, you know, when I look back now, and some of the stories are just iniquitous, like the mum, like Becky's stories, in terms of a child going back to school, the hair's grown, they're not going to hospital anymore, but being in trouble with the PE teacher because of the long-standing impacts, they're not being able to do PE terribly well, getting told off and getting detentions. Now, if you've got a child with an educational health and care plan, which everybody knows about, which have reviews, which the SENCO should be saying to that child's teachers, look, he or she can't do this anymore because of the illness and because of the treatment, even though they're in remission. That would stop that. But at the moment, they're not getting any of that. And it shouldn't be the need for parents to have the wherewithal emotionally and financially to get it sorted themselves.
And of course, for children, you know, their entire world is really what they've come to learn in school, in education. And when there's something, they must feel very frustrated and emotionally disturbed by being out of the system, out of education, and worrying about what they will lose out. And their peers are going faster than they are and progressing up the stages faster than they are through the curriculum. I mean, that's another material factor in the world of children. It's a massive emotional thing, isn't it?
Absolutely, and they'll never get that time back. I mean, some of these stories are absolutely heartbreaking, and I don't emote very much as a person. You know, I'm pretty objective, I'm pretty considered. But when I read this, it makes me ashamed to have been a senior educationalist and not known this. You know, a young woman who had got years of treatment in a school that changes management, and she's told by the head to her dad that really she'd be better off in a hospital school. Well, she didn't need to be in a hospital school. The nursing staff said she didn't need to be in a hospital school. Basically, as the child and the parent said, the school didn't want her. And they struggled, and they thought that dad got an educational health and care plan for her. So what happened when she went into school? Yeah, well, she's got to come in, but they put in a learning support unit.
That's extraordinary.
It's just shocking.
It is. And to Charlotte, what do you think about Becky? I mean, she was told when she asked for alternative education that her son wasn't actually ill enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to know what to say to that. I think that the problem is that it seems to me fairly obvious that a child who is going through what Becky's child was going through is going to need extra educational provision. And I think that you know, we can sort of give the normal answers, which is, you know, you get your ducks in a row, you get your doctors on side, you throw all of that information at the local authority in writing, and you say, you know, you put them in a position where it's just mind-bogglingly obvious on the papers that they have to provide that. But I think what Catherine was saying earlier about, you know, the mental load that both children and parents are under in these circumstances, you know, that sort of having to try and get all of those ducks in a row in circumstances where parents will already be sitting by their children's bedside. They'll be trying to collar the consultants who've got their children's care. They'll be sitting in on ward rounds. They'll be trying to keep family informed. They're probably looking after other children at home who also need them.
But Charlotte, sorry to stop you. I mean, what do you think, though, about the point about education otherwise? I mean, the rights for example, judicial review in that circumstance, when a local authority is saying, well, actually, to a child...
There is a claim that you can bring a claim for judicial review in respect of a failure to make educational provision under Section 19. To some extent, obviously, there's an element of needing your ducks in a row for that. It's a claim, well, you'll probably know more about this than I do, Mike, but I believe that in some circumstances you can make that claim, that's the child's claim. Am I right about that, Chris?
Yeah.
That is, yeah.
And Chris, I mean, Chris, what do you think about, I mean, one of the things, the other thing that was striking, I think, about Becky's story was that not only was she told that she couldn't get access, education otherwise for her son, but she was actually threatened with potential action for not sending her son to school.
Yes, that was another thing that stuck out to me. I'm really glad you invited me back in on that point, because as soon as I was thinking, gosh, I really want to talk about that. I mean, I think both with the response to the education otherwise than a school query, and with obviously the use of the education welfare officer as a threat here rather than a support, we just see really poor training on the local authority's part. I think that is the primary issue there. And that's one of the reasons why this petition and this awareness is so important, because as Charlotte said, you know, those parents and that child are going through probably the worst period of their lives. You know, they are not going to be in that same position that other parents will be, and even those parents, you know, with disabled children or who require an education healthcare plan for other reasons, you know, they're already going through a difficult enough period. But when you're going through cancer treatment as well, or your child is going through it, it's only going to make that harder. Yes, there's absolute legal rights that exist, and absolutely right. You know, I think Mike, and of course Charlotte as well, I think if Becky had come to us at that time, you know, we would have absolutely advised her properly and given her that support. But as Dame Cathy rightfully said, you know, you're thinking about your child's survival here. You know, you're not thinking about, oh, how can I get lawyers involved or things like this. It shouldn't even be required. And that is why I think the petition really has some real value here, because, you know, whatever the outcome to it, you know, even if a single local authority actually recognizes, you know what, if we have a child or young person diagnosed with cancer, we need to be proactive here. We need to go straight in, well, maybe not straight in, but as soon as they're safe and well enough to kind of start back in education, obviously the health issues taking priority, but getting everything ready for that child to be assessed and to have that provision in place, whether that's just home education or whether that is through an education healthcare plan, an additional special educational provision, whatever form is right for that child at that time, it really needs to be proactive. And if one singular local authority changes its views because of this petition or this video here, I think it'd be a worthy endeavour.
Thank you, Chris. And what does the petition cover? I mean, that you see there's so many hurdles that a parent of a child without cancer but with special education needs has to go through in order to get an assessment. The first job is to convince the local authority to an assessment, and part of the petition, one of the first point is that there should be an automatic entitlement to an assessment. Cathy, do you agree with that? I mean, that's one of the major points of this petition, isn't it?
Absolutely, because Chris is quite right. You know, some children simply won't be well enough to benefit from educational support. But that, for me, is secondary. If they have access to the need, then it doesn't have to say you'll start getting home tuition next week. What it does is recognise that the cognitive need as a result of the treatment exists. And as a result, we should be responding to it. So that, for me, is a really critical thing. They shouldn't have to wait. It should be an automatic assumption that they are going to need some support at some point. And getting that registered and getting the process begun immediately will be, I think, critical.
So we have the automatic assessment, and then, of course, the other problem that you got is time limits. Charlotte, I mean, getting an assessment is not going to give you an immediate result, no. Is it? When you're going through a very short period of chemotherapy, maybe 10, 12 weeks of chemotherapy, right. The assessment itself can take a long time, Charlotte.
It can, yeah. And we also know, unfortunately, that even with the fairly generous statutory limitations that exist at the moment, we know that local authorities do frequently overshoot them.
So this point number 2 in our petition is, the first point, remember, is there should be an automatic entitlement to an assessment. The second point is, let's just try and expedite this assessment process. So actually make the time limits very, very short indeed. Chris, what do you say? Do you agree with that?
Absolutely right. I think what we've discussed here is the need for action. I have to say, Dame Kathy shocked me earlier with the comment about how just after such a short few hours of treatment, it has an everlasting effect on a cancer patient's cognitive ability, particularly a child. And of course, that really does show the need for speed here, because this isn't necessarily something that's going to affect them a year, 2 years down the line. And we're thinking the 20-week general period for preparing or completing an assessment, and then obviously preparing an education healthcare plan, that could be too late. Of course, support at any stage is going to be helpful. I'm certainly not saying that, I'd say better late than never, but where we can shorten those time limits, where we can get that support in at the earliest opportunity in whatever form, even if it's, an hour per week to start with, if the child is very, very unwell, and gradually increasing, whatever that provision is, it really needs to be in place as soon as possible. And I think for the child's own mental health and well-being, it can provide a sense of normalcy as well. When they're going through what is an extraordinary process and an incredibly difficult process, to have some way to keep that contact with your school friends and your school, and to have that little sense of normalcy, even if it's a small Zoom session, as we're now getting used to this year, or some other format, is going to really, really help that child.
And Kathy, do you foresee a problem, though? I mean, a local authority might say, well, OK, it's all very well asking us to do an assessment in a very short period of time, but I mean, there's no real template that we should follow. How are we going to know what the child needs if we don't get proper, thorough evaluation of the individual circumstances in a thorough enough way? Or do you think there may be an answer to that through perhaps a sort of standard practice that you would expect children to need when they are undergoing this kind of treatment?
Absolutely. We did a trial in Manchester. It was supported by a charity called the Tutor Trust, which was set up to, they call it, to democratise private tutoring. And what they did was they took recommendations or referrals from the children and adolescent ward at the Christie for any young person who hadn't had any support, and none of them had, to see if they would like some support for GCSEs. And we did 2 or 3 of those over a sort of 6 to 9 months period. It was really successful. And they were trained specially to understand. They were trained by the staff from the Teenage Cancer Trust at the Christie to say, this is how you deal with somebody who's going through a lot of fatigue. So how you support them is proportionate to their need. But the thing about the need for children and the speed is because, of course, the development of children, when they are treated with chemotherapy, it has a much greater effect on them than it does on adults, because they are developing biologically and physically. So the speed is absolutely of the essence.
Thank you. And I think we've got that message. I mean, Charlotte, the other problem we've got is convincing a local authority we've got an assessment now. Let's assume that the petition succeeds and gets an assessment very quickly for a child. But the next question is, will there be an education healthcare plan following? I mean, it's not a foregone conclusion, is it, that every child will get an education healthcare plan?
It's not, and some parents unfortunately have had that experience of first they have to fight to get the needs assessment done, then they have to appeal the outcome of the needs assessment, which is that a plan shouldn't be issued. And then if they win that tribunal appeal, which many will, because the benchmark for issuing an EHC plan is often it's very obvious from the evidence that there is that gateway reached. And then they have to sort of potentially start the same process over the wording of the plan. So you're absolutely right. And I think, am I right in thinking that one of the things your petition is asking for is a sort of presumption to be built in for children with a cancer diagnosis that there should be an EHC plan.
You took the words right out of my mouth there, Charlotte. That's the third point. The code of practice, which of course the local authority must follow, should contain, we say, a presumption in favour of, in all cases where a child is undergoing chemotherapy and is suffering from cancer, to be secured an education and healthcare plan. That's our petition. Kathy, is there anything else that you think that you could add to those 3 points that we think that we want the government to recognise?
In terms of what you said about, well, what would a local authority look to put in there? There's so much evidence from the medics. You know, let's just get the medical specialists and the educational specialists together, because that would solve it. At the moment, education doesn't seem to want to recognise the responsibility with an educational issue that has been created as a result of health.
Mm.
Well, thank you. I mean, children with cancer really should not have to go through this kind of hurdle crossing to get the support that they need. I mean, and that's the petition really. 3 points. The presumption in favour at all times, an automatic entitlement to a statutory assessment. When there is a statutory assessment, that the time limit within which to complete that assessment should be much, much shorter than the time limit that's currently prescribed. And the presumption thereafter should be, in all circumstances, in favour of their those such children having an education and healthcare plan. Those of you who may be following me on Facebook and watching this broadcast, you will notice that I have shared a link on my Facebook profile for you to go to and to hear more about our petition and for you to be able to sign your name to that petition. Please, we need your help on that. I'd like to thank everyone for that rather emotive topic, and I do hope that we're going to see some success in coming weeks, and I think we'll be inviting in the future a medic on to explain the kind of things that Kathy was explaining to us a moment ago. Well, some of you will remember that on the 2nd of December, I wrote a letter to Matt Hancock, and I know he's extremely burdened with the COVID crisis, but there's a lot of people who are seriously suffering as a result of COVID, and particularly in the world of children with autism and their need to get support from mental health services. And you will recall that I wrote a letter to Mr. Hancock to explain the absolute travesty, I think, of CAM services denying support to children who are in need of mental health support because they have an intellectual disability or that they may have autism. I wanted my guests to stay today, and particularly Dame Catherine August, to give a view really about, as a practitioner, about what she thinks about that letter. Kathy, please tell us.
I could not understand that response, because the whole point of having an education system is to enable children to develop to the full potential. If you're saying to some, because you've got this particular disability, we're going to deny you the opportunity to have support for other things that might develop separate to that issue, the original issue, is just bizarre. It's almost like rationing what you can have in terms of your need. Why?
And they say, Kathy, is that mental difficulties of the kind that parents need help for their children comes with the territory in autism. I found that absolutely breathtaking, did you not?
Absolutely. Certainly the youngsters that I've had, mostly in a mainstream school, it's ones with Asperger's rather than full autism. But actually, if you get things right, those children can be as happy and as joyous and as fulfilled as any others. If you are going to deny them those support services at times when they need it, and indeed many people need it, irrespective of whether they've got any other disability, it flies in the face of having a system whereby you're supposed to have some entitlement to life chances.
And Charlotte, I mean, the door being closed on so many people's faces, really. They're saying when they're asking for support, they're being denied this support. Do you foresee a potential judicial review challenge here?
Yes, I think that is potentially in the offing. It's an interesting question because there's obviously a kind of intersection between, on the one hand, principles of public law around fairness and reasonableness and lawfulness, and on the other hand, medical criteria for treatment for a certain service. But yeah, I mean, when we are getting to a point where we are sort of routinely in a situation where children are either not being referred at all, or they're being referred and the referral is just being turned down, that's obviously a very difficult place for us to be in terms of child safety.
And Chris, you've seen the letter that I've written. I mean, there is actual evidence that I have seen whereby the service have written to these parents and said, because you are suffering from autism, we offer no service. We're not even commissioned to provide any service.
Right, and I think there's only one way to phrase that, and that's discrimination. You know, it is, as we heard previously, you know, during our last program, you know, from Dr. Babaraj, who is himself a psychiatrist, you know, although you may want to have a good look at what might be kind of a presentation of autism versus kind of an anxiety or other mental health condition, it is by no means the case that a person with ASD is somehow immune from mental health difficulties. And as you said, Mike, and obviously we had that very tragic story in our last case as well about a young man who took his own life due to a lack of support for people with autism and mental health difficulties. It is so vital for them to receive support during this time. And as was set out in your letter, you know, there is evidence for this. This isn't just a bold statement. And what's worse, I think, is, you know, even if we were to say, hypothetically, you know, CAMHS themselves were not in a position to assist. They did not have the expertise. In principle, I'm not against any institution saying, oh, sorry, that's not one for us. But they must be able to signpost to an institution that does. And unfortunately, there is not that institution presently. It's just, oh, we can't help. Tough luck. And that is leaving people who are so vulnerable and going through such tragic circumstances with no solution. And of course, what does that do? Well, that leads to despair. That then worsens the condition. And of course, as we heard firsthand, does lead to tragedy. It is appalling.
Charlotte, children are losing their lives because of this. I mean, it is as serious as I can't express it any more bluntly than that. I mean, we've heard in episode 1 that of a child who did, take his own life and was in desperate need for CAMHS service, and yet was denied. I mean, really, I can see that a whole barrage of complaints and cases, I think, that's going to arise as a result of this. I've asked Mr. Hancock that I've asked him to make it quite clear by a direction to all health service providers, because the National Health Service England have said, or and the same equivalent, I think, in Wales are saying there's no policy here. We haven't got any policy. We're not denying services, but there's a practice.
Yeah. And that ties in, I think, with what Chris was saying about potentially discrimination. I mean, there are lots of different, there are lots of potential claims that individuals could bring. There are negligence claims, there are public law claims, there are discrimination claims. And, you know, obviously, as a, you know, sort of coming into it from a lawyer's perspective, we tend to kind of pull back because we're aware of how individual circumstances can influence these cases. But there is a general concern, which I think it's not really, you know, it's not really a secret that the service is overburdened. It's not a secret that cases that perhaps would have been picked up 2 or 3 years ago are not now, because the criteria have changed, and the criteria have changed in response to the situation that service sees itself in. But yes, as you say, there are a number of different ways that could be approached in terms of legal claims.
And Kathy, from a head teacher's perspective, it's not a common trend we see in autistic cases, and it's not a common trend with children with intellectual disability that they'll always exhibit these kind of mental health difficulties. No, they vary.
Absolutely. They're individuals, just as anybody else is. They have a right to be an individual, and they will respond to circumstances differently, as we all do. The fact that if you happen to have been defined as having that disability that's called autism, and you then start to experience other mental health issues because of what's happening in your life, that you can't have the treatment somebody else can, it's just quite extraordinary.
I mean, I would say, and as I said in my letter, that it's a national scandal and deeply offensive to those with autism and with intellectual disability.
Absolutely. And, you know, I would imagine if you go around the the maths and physics department in many a top university, you will find people who will fit the diagnosis of autism quite easily because they cover a huge spectrum of abilities, of personalities, of needs. You know, it's ridiculous. And it's the same about, we tend to think of autism and young men, but actually that's because girls with autism are often not diagnosed, and they also will exhibit issues to do with mental health, sometimes because they haven't had the proper diagnosis of their actual autism. You know, this is a huge area of need that is not being dealt with for other reasons, and it is almost a national scandal.
I would say not almost. I think it is a national scandal.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is. I mean, and I think I'll just sort of round off by saying that we've not yet had a reply to that letter, but I'll just tell you what I said right at the end. I said, discharging autistic people in need reinforces their isolation. They're already isolated enough. Children with autism are often left alone, and a good government is one that would strive to avoid them making them feel alone. So thank you for that. Now, there's been lots of information that you've probably been seeing on Facebook and social media about the recent case of Kay and Hillingdon, and that case has put to rest another scandal. Maybe I don't use the motive terminology so much as a national scandal, but there is a scandal. Everything's a scandal today. But about children who are being denied mediation services, whereby in circumstances where they've been asking for lawyers to assist them at mediation. I mean, Charlotte, what do you say about that?
I can't see, well, the rules are that an advocate should assist, you know, that parents are entitled to bring an advocate to mediation. And as far as I'm aware, advocates can mean lots of different people and supporters. But one thing the word advocate certainly does mean is a lawyer.
Chris, what do you make of what the judge said in that case about the local authority that refused to provide a mediation service to a parent who wanted mediation just because they said that there was a lawyer coming with them?
Well, I think that the court was very clear that when the rules say any advocate, obviously that includes a lawyer. I mean, it was shocking the case needed to go to court to begin with, frankly, Mike. And I think that what I really can't fathom, I think, in this case and other cases like it, is why local authorities and other parties like to view lawyers as a kind of antagonistic or somehow disruptive to the negotiation process. I mean, every solicitor or barrister worth their salt should always look to reconcile differences first to see if a mutually agreeable position can be reached, and yet only put their client's case firmly where it appears that the other party are not seeking to arrange reasonable provision. And that really is what happens in practice. So to deny parents the right to a lawyer was foolish to begin with, and I'm very, very glad that the court just simply put that to right.
Kathy, did you read the judgment yourself?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
I mean, what did you think of her comment that where she said that it's daunting enough for children, parents of children with special educational needs to confront local authorities? What did you make of that? And when she said about,
well, you know, well, it is. I mean, it just is. If you're facing a huge bureaucracy, then, and you've not got any particular professional experience in having to do that, why will you not feel absolutely overawed by the task you've taken on? And why would you not want somebody to stand alongside you, shoulder to help you? And I just was so glad I wasn't working in that local authority and had to receive that letter. I was squirming reading it just as a, you know, as an observer. Dear me.
Well, I mean, to make the point
that,
and the judge, of course, said, I'm just looking at the judgment. I mean, the judge said about what Chris's point was about the lawyers and what the support lawyers can offer. The judge said it's entirely wrong-headed to equate professional lawyers with confrontation, and went on to say that many lawyers act very successfully as mediators and support families in non-adversarial ways. Charlotte?
I think that's a really good point, actually. It's one of the misconceptions that I really struggle with in terms of our profession, because I think what people see when they see a lawyer is they think about jousting in the courtroom, cross-examination, brilliant barbed repartee, you know, very, very clever, very difficult people. And actually, the truth is we're all human, we're all fallible. And actually, a lot of the work we do as lawyers is conciliatory. It's about trying to get people to compromise. It's about trying to show everybody where the way home might be. So yeah, I think the judge was spot on with that, and I really wish that that would work its way into the wider conscience.
Thank you, Charlotte. Well, it's Christmas, and we've talked about so many things today in this episode, and I wanted just to simply talk about our wishes and aspirations for the new year. Chris, if you had 20 seconds to tell us what your main wish is for the new year, what would that be?
Well, no pressure, Mike. Got to get it out in 20 seconds. But I have to say, 2020 has been a year like no other, and we've all faced various challenges in various ways. I think that 2021, my wish is that these vaccinations take hold and we start to see goodbye to the coronavirus. But in terms of the world of education, I am particularly excited as a lawyer and a Welshman to see how the Additional Learning Needs Act takes hold. It's due to come in September 2021. No doubt we'll talk about it in the new year. But I look forward to seeing how that impacts the rights of children and young people here in Wales and helping families and children through that process.
Yes, and of course to our wonderful guest, Dame Cathy August, who, by the way, you must know, the Education magazine is a bit like Hotel California, Dame Cathy, because when you come and join us, you never leave, because I'm going to invite you back and back and back. So please tell us, tell us
That's
what.
Fine with me.
Tell us your aspirations for the new year.
3 wishes. 1, that our campaign takes off and we get huge numbers of people supporting it. Secondly, that we get mass vaccination. And thirdly, my guilty secret is watching Coronation Street. And I want some happy storylines because I'm fed up with murder and mayhem.
Yes, absolutely. And Charlotte, I mean, I haven't been watching. You've been watching what's going to come on in the new year, TV wise. I suppose what's your thoughts about the new year? Well,
I have the same aspiration that I always have, which is that I hope that people will continue to expand their understanding of special educational needs and disability, and that things will become easier for children and adults who have a condition that makes it harder for them to operate in a neurotypical world. I also hope, I don't know, I'm kind of copying Catherine here, but I do really hope that we are able to find our way out of this pandemic and back to some normality, and that everybody's mental health resets itself, because I think that everyone, however well adjusted they are, is starting to lose their equilibrium a bit, and we are overdue for sort of light at the end of the tunnel. So I really hope for that. In terms of television, I have to say my televisual choices are mainly around Peppa Pig. So really? I am looking forward to discovering a bit more Peppa Pig on a carefully rationed and doled out basis with my 3-year-old girl next year.
Well, we all love Peppa Pig, and we love Percy Pigs from Marks and Spencer's. I like.
Everything Peggy is good.
I mean, aspirations for the new year. I mean, I think, to be honest, I second everything that you've all said, because I think that the pandemic needs to. We want a light at the end of the tunnel. I think the vaccine is an end of the tunnel moment, and I just hope, as Charlotte said quite rightly, that the reset for people's mental health, because it's a real crisis, and I'm getting it all the time. And also, I hope for our firm, I'd like to be able to expand it even more, because I'm consciously aware, I'm so acutely aware that we're unable to answer all of your questions in the speed that we want to really do so. And I fully appreciate there's such a pressing need for support, and there's just not enough of us all to go around. So I want us to expand our services, and hopefully we can reach out more to you for the new year, to give you more help, and to expand some legal aid support services which are available to those who can't afford it otherwise. So that's my aspirations for the new year, and it brings me to the final moments of the Education magazine, and of course to introduce you to our very special guest. And who would you think would be frequenting our offices around this time, Christmas? Well, before I introduce you to that special guest, I'd like to thank all my guests for joining us here at the Education magazine's Christmas edition. Thank you sincerely to Dame Cathy August, who you will be seeing again. Cathy, thank you very much for joining us today.
Very welcome, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And of course, to our great Chris McFarland and Charlotte Hadfield. Thank you, Chris, and to you all a very Merry Christmas, and I hope you have a peaceful and happy New Year.
Thank you, Mike, and yes, Merry Christmas to all, as we say here in Wales, Nadolig Llawen.
And Charlotte, happy Christmas to you, and look forward to being with you in the new year on many cases and many Education Magazine shows.
Thank you, Mike, and Merry Christmas to you as well.
And that, of course, finally brings me to our very special guest. Here he is, as he visited our Sinclairslaw offices. Enjoy this clip. It's a bit of light-hearted relief. Enjoy, and Merry Christmas to you all.
Social mixing between households in private places, including gardens, and pubs and bars must close unless they can operate solely as a restaurant serving alcohol only as part of a main meal.
To emphasize that the CDC is not recommending the use of medical grade or surgical grade masks.
Throughout the European Union, we have different color codes, different criteria, and different rules on testing and quarantine.
Hello, Mr. Christmas.
Hello.
Welcome to Sinclairslaw.
Right.
I see you here for some advice on the lockdown rules.
Yeah.
If you'd like to take a seat, Mr. Evans will be with you shortly.
Right.
Hi, Mr. Evans. Mr. Christmas is here for you. Okay, I'll send him in.
Good evening, Santa. Welcome.
Right.
You've come for some urgent advice, haven't you, about coronavirus rules?
Yeah.
Well, I've been checking the rules. There is good news and there's bad news.
Oh.
Now, the good news, Santa, is that a vaccine has become available.
Oh.
And as you're over 2,000 years old, you're on the priority list. But there's also bad news, Santa, and that is that you can't go into Tier 3 in England on Christmas Eve. Also, there are Brexit problems, and it may well be that there'll be tariffs on all the goods that you bring in and the goods that you take out. Now in Wales, you can't have a mince pie after 6 o'clock, and you can't have a glass of sherry in Wales either. In England, you can have a glass of sherry, provided you have a substantial meal with it. What is a substantial meal? It could be a mince pie, it could be a Scotch egg, it could be a piece of chocolate. No, you can't go to Australia. They've closed the borders until next year. The rangers have to be socially distanced at least 2 meters apart at all times. I know, it's not good. And if you go to America, it's worse. Mr. Trump never wears a mask. Most Americans don't wear masks. And Mr. Trump's on the naughty list, so forget the USA. We could do this all day, I'm afraid. You can go down the chimney, but only if there's not 6 people already living in the house. Don't forget hands, face, space. Wear your face mask at all times, Santa, and lots of sanitizer after every visit.
Mr. Evans,
hello.
Easter Bunny's just arrived. He's a bit early.
Could you ask him to wait a bit? I'm just finishing up with Santa. Thank you, Santa. Thank you for coming. And wear your face mask.
Oh,